Triumphant Birth Podcast. I'm Jamie Raisleger, doula, childbirth educator, and mom of 3, including twin babies. Join us as we explore the transformative power of healing through childbirth, delve into the options, receive guest expert wisdom, and hear inspiring stories that pave the way for healing and wholeness throughout pregnancy, birth, and beyond. In a culture where birth is often viewed with fear, we aim to shift the narrative by showcasing pregnancy and birth as opportunities for personal growth, enhanced experiences, and generational healing. Whether the journey is smooth sailing or filled with unexpected challenges, this podcast offers a supportive space for birth workers and everyone navigating their profound realities in the childbearing season of life. Tune in and embark on a journey toward empowerment, resilience, and triumph. Your babies will thank you. Hello. So I'm popping in really quickly. This is the intro to the intro, just to let you know that I am going to be splitting this episode up into 2 parts. We had a really insightful conversation here with Dr. Stu and Dr. Freeze, talking about the paper and all things home birth. And it was just a really good, insightful conversation for me. And I hope it is for you too. So I hope you can forgive an semi-abrupt end to this episode, knowing that we will pick up with the conversation again next week. And as long as I have you here, I am going to take this chance to unashamedly request that if you enjoy the podcast and the guests and the stories, would you please log on to your podcast platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and leave me a review. Right now, it's a one-woman show, so I'm doing this all on my own. And whether it's a review formally or whether it's just feedback, it's really helpful for me to know what information you find valuable. So whether that's through a review or whether you find me on Instagram at triumphant_birth and send me a DM, I'm always up to hear your feedback. I'm always up, down for that, whatever the terminology is. So go ahead and do that if you feel so inclined, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Triumphant Birth Podcast. I am so excited to be here today with my 2 guests, Dr. Stu and Dr. Freeze, and they've both given me permission to use their first names, so that's what I'm going to do today. Dr. Stu, I love your shirt. Vaginal breath. What does it say? Vaginal birth of breech and multiples is possible. That's so perfect, because today we are going to be talking about your twin paper. We'll get into that. I'll read your bios first, and then we'll go right into talking about the paper. I'm very, very excited to talk with you about this today. So we'll start with Dr. Stu. Stuart J. Fischbein, MD, is a community-based obstetrician and an associate of the American College of OBGYN, published author of the book Fearless Pregnancy, Wisdom and Reassurance from a Doctor, a Midwife, and a Mom, and peer-reviewed papers Home Birth with an Obstetrician, a series of 135 out-of-hospital births, breech birth at home, outcomes of 60 breech and 109 cephalic, planned home birth and birth center births, and twin home birth, outcomes of 100 sets of twins in the care of a single practitioner. That's the one we're going to talk about today. After completing his residency at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in LA, Dr. Stu, as he is known, spent 24 years assisting women with hospital birthing and, for the next 12 plus years, was a home birth obstetrician who worked directly with midwives assisting local Southern California families. Since retiring from attending home births in late 2022, Dr. Stu has turned his focus to traveling around the world as a lecturer and advocate for reteaching breech and twin birth skills, respect for the normalcy of birth, and honoring informed consent. He hosts the weekly Birthing Instincts podcast with co-host Bliss Young, and together they offer hope, reassurance, and safe, honest, evidence-supported choices for those women who understand pregnancy is a normal bodily function not to be feared. Follow him on Instagram at Birthing instincts. He can be reached, and we'll put your links in the show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, they can. So Dr. Stu has been on the podcast already. His episode is the third episode that we did. If anyone wants to go back and hear his origin story and philosophy and all of that. So let's move on to Dr. Freeze. So Dr. Rixa Freeze has a PhD in American Studies. It's hard for me to say her first names. I don't know why that is. But you're going to be Dr. Stu and Dr. Freeze. Okay, so Dr. Rixa Freeze has a PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. Her doctoral studies focused on the history of healthcare and medicine, with specialization in pregnancy, childbirth, and maternity care. Her dissertation examined why women in North America choose unassisted home births. She worked as a visiting assistant professor for 9 years at Wabash College before founding Breach Without Borders in 2018. Breach Without Borders is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to breach training, education, and advocacy. She has published about why women choose home birth and attitudes toward home birth in the U.S. In 2018, she co-authored a study of breech and cephalic home births. In the following year, she published an article about outcomes of breech at home, birth centers, and hospitals in Midwifery Today. She co-authored a chapter, Free Birth in the United States, in the 2020 book, Birthing Outside the System, The Canary in the Coal Mine. She is the main author of the textbook, A Guide to Physiological Breech Birth, now in its second edition, which is a beautiful book, by the way. If any, I'm going to link all these things. Her analysis of 100 sets of twin home births, co-authored with Dr. Stu, was published in December 2024 with PLOS ONE. Is that an acronym?
Yeah, Public Library of Science, I think is what it stands for, but it goes by the journal name PLOS ONE.
Gotcha. Okay, so current research projects for Dr. Freeze include a video analysis of 207 physiological breech births, a qualitative analysis of the obstacles American physicians face in supporting vaginal breech birth, and a review of the effectiveness of an international vaginal breech training program. She also oversees DNP and Bachelor of Midwifery research projects relating to breech birth. So, okay. That's a mouthful for both of you. Needless to say that you are both such powerhouses in the birth realm. And I'm just so honored to have both of you on the podcast to talk about your twin home birth paper. So thank you for being here.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm super excited to talk with you.
Yeah, we're Jamie, excited actually to have this, because Rixa and I don't often get to see each other very often. So the fact that we're both here together is a joy for me as well. So thank you, Jamie.
Amazing. And there are some time zone differences as well, right? Are you in France right now, Rixa?
Yeah, I am. I'll get back in the States in early August.
Okay, amazing. So thank you again. I mean, that's a whole nother layer of coordination that I'm very appreciative of. So what I would like to do next, I'll read an introduction to the paper, and then I'm going to stop reading because it's a lot of words. And then I just like to discuss it. So, all right, this is from the Breach Without Borders website. This study, co-authored by Dr. Stu and Dr. Freeze, follows 100 sets of twins attended at home by an obstetrician. The first publication looking exclusively at twin home birth. Overall, 91.3% of women gave birth vaginally, compared to a national average of 25.2% for twin pregnancies. Most women with twin pregnancies in a hospital setting have few options but cesarean section, even though the evidence shows no benefit to surgery for the majority of cases. This study demonstrates that a home setting that supports physiological birth can yield excellent outcomes and a high vaginal birth rate. And then I just want to read one more paragraph, and these are your comments about the paper. Properly selected, motivated twin mothers can successfully birth in a home setting if they have a supportive environment, a skilled practitioner, and a competent team of birth workers. Vaginal birth of twins, regardless of presentation, so breech or cephalic, or birth location, is a reasonable option with excellent success rates in skilled hands and should be offered. Residency training programs should reinstitute the teaching of these skills to ensure that women desiring hospital births are not pushed outside the system. Professional medical organizations and state legislatures should recognize the value and dedication of midwifery care in the community and stop limiting choices under the guise of safety that rightfully belong to the pregnant woman. The goal should be to create a nurturing environment where each woman is treated with dignity, compassion, and respect by a skilled twin practitioner, and where her choices are not just tolerated, but enthusiastically supported. I could cry just reading that. I mean, like, that's the end of the podcast. Like, boom, done. That's the end. I really could. It makes me emotional because of my personal experience, obviously, and that's not what this podcast is about. But so I tend to do this. I have guests on that I really admire, and then I'm like, okay, let's not make this a love fest, Jamie. Come on, you have to like talk about the actual information. So I know that this paper has been years in the making, and that you both have worked so hard on it. And there was a lot of back and forth in the process of getting it published. Before we go into the paper itself, can we talk a little bit about how your paths crossed and how you both met?
Stu, I think I first met you in person in Ottawa in 2009 at the Breach Conference. But I think I'd interviewed you before then. I think we did that interview for my blog prior to 2009. Does that sound right to you, time frame wise?
I don't have a timeline set in my head, but I remember exactly where I was when we were talking. I was standing outside the Century City Mall movie theater, and we were talking, and you did the interview while I was standing there, because I can still remember that for your Stand and Deliver blog.
Yeah.
I don't remember. All I remember from Ottawa was going to a hockey game with Michael Hall, another breech guru from Colorado, and that's what I remember about the Ottawa Breech Conference. But yeah, it was probably at least 15, 16, 17 years ago, right?
Yeah, and I think when I interviewed you for my blog, that was right when you were starting to go into home birth or just getting kicked out of the hospital. Not kicked out. The hospitals were making bans on breech and twins and VBAC to the point that you said that was not tenable anymore.
Yeah, well, that would have been summer of 2010. So maybe it was you interviewed me after the conference then.
Yeah, I'll look up on my blog when I have a moment. But it was right around the time either you were just thinking about home birth or you were just starting it, one of the two. So yeah, it was an interesting time, I think, because you were going through a lot, and it was right around the time that ICANN was doing that huge project of seeing who had VBAC bans. They tried to contact every maternity center in the U.S. to get a feel for who was banning VBAC and who not. Because I remember I was making phone calls about that about the same time too. I helped a little bit on my end phone, like, I don't know, probably 5 or 10 hospitals to get their VBAC ban status. So.
And my recollection is, again, if it's that was probably the time that we spoke, right around 2009 or 2010, and I'd been fighting with my hospital for some time about the fact that they were doing things that were unethical, like banning VBAC, and I had a collaborative practice with 2 certified nurse midwives, and we practiced in a little sister hospital in Camarillo, California, and our office was across the street from that hospital. And somewhere around 2008 or 2009, they decided they were going to ban the midwives from working at that hospital and make us drive, an extra 20, 25 minutes to another hospital in a different city in order for the midwives to do the work, which made it really inconvenient for us. At the same time, they were banning VBAC. And then they began to talk about banning breech delivery. And I remember in June of 2010, I had done 3 breech deliveries in the month of June at the hospital, and they all came out fine. And yet I was given a letter by the chairman of the department that said if I did another breech delivery, that I would be kicked off staff. And I said, you can't kick me off staff because I have a letter here called a privileging sheet that you signed that's good for 2 years that says that I can do breech delivery. And he says, well, I don't care about that. If you do another one, you're going to be in big trouble. And so at that point, I had to make the decision of what to do. And instead of trying to kick me off staff, which would have been a legal nightmare for them, they did have the option of not renewing my privileges when they came up for renewal later that year. And that's something any club can do, basically. They can tell your member, if you're up for renewal, they can say, we're not renewing your membership. And I chose not to fight them because I had good legal counsel, and it would have been a very expensive, long, drawn-out process that, because it's an administrative process, we probably would have lost. So I had wise people advise me, Stu, why don't you just start doing home birthing? And so that all occurred around that time. And then I began doing home birthing. And it's funny, after 24 years of backing midwives, I had never been to a home birth, which is probably true of almost every obstetrician that's out there. They criticize them, they talk about them, they don't know anything about them. They have no experience with them whatsoever. And I went to my first couple of home births. I was quite nervous because I just still had a lot of hospital-based physician in me, and it was took a few years for me to get that out of my system. And then I realized that, like, I can do breeches in the hospital, I could do twins in the hospital. Why can't I do them at home? And that sort of triggered my interest in doing those things at home, because they had no choices in California. Midwives were not allowed to do twins or breeches. So that's sort of how it got started for me, and how Rixa and I, Rixa was sort of a mentor and a catalyst for me. And by the way, neither one of my papers, well, maybe they would have been published, but I can't say that, but neither our breech paper or our twin paper would ever have been published without Rixa's knowledge and perseverance and connection. So I'm eternally grateful to have had this relationship with you, Rixa. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I was looking up, it was August 2009 that we spoke. That's when the first time we had some kind of an interaction. So it was in the middle of that breech and VBAC band mess. Yeah, and I want to say thanks, because I know it took longer than you thought each time. I had to kind of talk you down from the ledge a lot, like, it's okay, it's going to take a long time. And also I took a long time because I had certain things I wanted to do a certain way. And, so it's never fast getting publications done. And, you'd like them out 1 year and it might be a year or two later before they actually get taken. But I'm glad we took the time to do it, because I'm really happy with how each of these turned out.
Oh, me too. And your listeners would be interested. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but the peer review process is something that most people don't understand, including myself. And that's why Rixa had to talk me off a ledge a few times, because peer reviewers are not paid, and they're anonymous, and they're all generally medicalized people. They sort of live in the medicalized world because that's who they approach. And I'll never forget, for the twin paper, one of the things that was so obtuse by the reviewer was that he criticized us for not following ACOG guidelines. And it's like, well, that's the whole point of our paper, is to not follow ACOG guidelines. So he didn't get it. So Rixa actually asked for a different reviewer, and we got a different reviewer. Yeah. And then we finally got put through peer review. But it was a painstaking process, because it sits on people's desks for months. And if you don't nudge them politely, nothing gets done. And I don't have that kind of patience. I'm not an academician.
I specifically remember I feel like everything traces back to the Breech and Twin Conference for me last year. And I remember you guys kind of talking about that in each of your talks, and just how arduous that process was. So thank you for persevering through that, both of you. We can talk a little bit more about the peer review process too, but I want to go back just a little bit, because I have not had Rixa on before. So would you be willing to go through a little bit of your origin story just briefly? I guess, when did you start becoming interested in this whole thing with home birth, with twin birth, with free birth? What started it for you?
Yeah, it started the first year of my PhD program. I was in American Studies, and I thought I'd be writing about food and culture. That's what I entered in. It's a multidisciplinary program, so you can kind of choose whatever focus you want. But I went in, I had done a master's program, and I wrote about like the Americanization of fast food culture in France. And I was thinking, yeah, food and culture, that's interesting. I'll do something on that. But I met a fellow PhD student who, over the first Christmas break, had a baby, and I was asking her after how it went. And she was telling me that she had wanted a home birth, but she couldn't find any midwives because in Iowa at the time they were not legal. So she had a hospital birth with the CNMs and had a really disappointing experience and said, I'm never doing that again. I'm going to have a home birth next time. And I was looking for a topic for a feminist research methodologies class. I had to find a big semester project. And that sparked an interest because I had never thought about home birth or midwives, didn't know anything about it really. And I was like, ooh, that sounds really interesting. Midwives are not legal in Iowa. What's up with that? It was so completely unknown to me and sounded like an excellent topic for a semester-long paper. So I checked out all the books in the library that I could find on midwives and home birth. And by luck, the very first book I sat down and read, I can picture where in the library I was reading the book, like on this one upholstered chair in this certain corner of the University of Iowa library. And I read Peggy Vincent's Baby Catcher, which is a fantastic memoir of a home birth midwife in Berkeley, California in the 80s and 90s. So you imagine all the shenanigans people get up to in Berkeley in the 80s and 90s as a home birth midwife and the crazy clientele she serves. And it was so engaging and so interesting and opened a world that I'd never before imagined. And I read that book and I'm like, this is my life passion. I'm going to do stuff about birth. This is it. And I'm going to have all my babies at home and I'm ready to have children, which was for me very huge because I knew kind of vaguely in the future someday maybe I'd have kids, but it was a very unpleasant thing, pregnancy and birth, and had never really thought much about it. So it was like this yucky thing that I had to go through at some nebulous future point, but I was really not interested in it at all. And reading that book totally changed my perspective. And it went from something that was kind of degrading to me that we had to kind of go through. And why would you ever want to go through that? And why would you ever want to feel it? To, I want to do this. And it's an important life ritual, rite of passage. And I want to feel it all. And I want to have it all. And I want to know what it's like. And I want to do it at home. And I don't want anybody else telling me how to do it. So it's interesting how just one book can completely change the trajectory of your life. I mean, for me, that was the book. I still love that book. I actually think it's the best childbirth preparation book I've ever read. And I've read all sorts and they're all great, but honestly, just reading her memoir and the description of how women labor and the massive variety of what they might do in labor, I felt so prepared because you go through the gauntlet of anything from sweet, easy, peaceful labors to crazy, wild, insane experiences. And I was like, I got this. I am totally ready. So that was my introduction into birth. And then I started following around home birth midwives and going to births with them while I was doing my PhD. I became a doula and went to some births. I was trying to get pregnant at the time, but it took a couple of years. And so I was immersed in the birth world, both outside of academia and inside academia. I decided to write my PhD about why women choose unassisted birth, which was super interesting. And that took me through the end of my PhD years. I graduated when I was pregnant with baby number 2. And for a couple of years, I was mostly just having babies and breastfeeding a lot. And so I wasn't doing a ton academically, but I still was publishing here and there. You read in my bio some of the things I was working on. Started working part-time as a professor. But during that whole time, breech caught my interest. And I wasn't doing a lot with it, but I was doing enough that I was going to the big conferences. So like in '09 in Ottawa, where you were, and then again in 2012. And I did some research on breech, mostly just to be able to present at the conference to help pay my conference ticket because I had no institutional funding yet. So that kind of kept me just a tiny bit on the periphery of the breech world. I was mostly just an interested outsider. And then in 2016, I have 4 kids. My youngest went to school for the first time. She was 3, and in France, you start public school at age 2.5 to 3. So I had time. And I was like, I really want to do more with this breech thing. It's super interesting to me still. So I took about a year going through all of PubMed, reading every single hit on PubMed on breech in the entire database. So I was like, I really want to know the literature, and I just should read everything. Naively, didn't realize quite how long it would take. But what it did is it gave me a really, really comprehensive background on what we know and what we don't know. And is able to put a lot of that knowledge together into different lectures. And then slowly that started to turning into more lectures and more invitations to speak, which turned into these early versions of what are now our breech workshops that we teach. And this was before I started Breech Without Borders. And then in 2018, I started the organization. So that's a little bit the trajectory of what brought me into the birth world itself, and then how I got into the breech part of things. And Breech Without Borders took off even more than I would ever have imagined. So here we are, 6-7 years later, and we just trained 12 new instructors last week in Nice and really looking to expand internationally.
That's so incredible. And I'm just so grateful for all of that work. And it's encouraging to hear also how your how your mothering journey was like intertwined within that, because that's so like that's a lot to be doing your PhD and mothering these children and founding Breach Without
Yeah.
Borders. Like it's very, very inspiring. So I love that you included that in the story as well.
Yeah. Nap time and bedtime, that's when I got my PhD written. It was amazing. Like I didn't have a lot of time, so that when I had those little moments of free time during when she went down for a nap and went to bed, I had to be so focused and I had to just work like crazy. I had a neighbor kid right next door who would also come and kind of play with my daughter just in the house, kind of babysit, but I was around, but I would go up in my office and work. And yeah, you just have to do it, and you can't waste any time when you have time. So it teaches you things when you're mothering little ones and you have to get some other stuff done.
I'm going to make a bracelet and it's going to say, what would Rixa do when I'm, in the throes of all of this. So for any new listeners, my twins are 14 months old. And I have a 6-year-old too. So that's why I say that. It's a lot. But you're so inspiring. I just love that so much. So at what point did the paper kind of come into, like, whose idea was it to put these numbers together? Was it something that was this idea for a long time, or how long were you compiling the numbers? What did that all look like?
Well, I think I saw it. I think, Rixa, you were in Amsterdam, right? The Breach Conference? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's when I don't remember when we got together to talk about the Breach paper, which came out in 2018. It's hard to believe that was 7 years ago already, but no. So I collaborated with Rixa on that first paper, partly because I'm not an academician and I'm not a statistician and I don't know how to do those sorts of things. I am a clinician and I'm a doer, and I'm the one that, did all the deliveries, but I didn't know how to put it all together. And so I collaborated with Rixa, who's got first of all, she is a Excel spreadsheet genius, which I love. So we got that together. And then as I was nearing sort of the end of my clinical run in Los Angeles, I was getting old and I was getting tired of being on call. And I realized, I looked back and I saw how many twins that I had done, and it was closing in on 100. And I just thought, this is something that there is no data on home twin birth. There's really, if you read the paper, Rixa does a great job of looking through reviewing the literature, and there's just almost nothing on home twin birth, and certainly nothing with a single practitioner and certain, using certain guidelines, so that you have consistency between all the different deliveries, as opposed to a multi-center study where you have really no control over who's doing what, and certainly not on home birth. And I was just inspired to do it, and that's my best memory. And then I think I approached Rixa and asked her if she'd be willing to do it, and I think she jumped at the opportunity. And then we used to just meet on Zoom periodically, and we'd go through the numbers, and she would collate things, and she'd say, I need more information on this, or I need more information. Then I'd have to go back and find the charts or the notes and do that sort of thing. And we finally got it put all together. So that's sort of how it worked. And then we wrote it, and we each wrote our own little things and sections and put it all together. And some of the stuff we wrote together as we were talking, and some of the stuff I would write and send it to her, or she would write, send it to me, and it all got incorporated into the paper. So it was a really easy, nice collaboration, which is, again, I'm really proud of that paper, because there are midwives that Rixa mentioned in the paper. There are midwives that have done 500 or more sets of twins at home, but they're not academicians either. They don't keep their data. They didn't collate their data. And it's too bad, because some of that gets lost. And we really need to know, because doctors are always saying things that are based on their own opinion and not based on any evidence. And one of the things they say is that twin home birth is dangerous. You should never do twin home birth. They think twin vaginal birth in the hospital is dangerous. So, the idea that anything at home is going to happen is always dangerous to them. But they have no evidence to say that. So they were just saying it. So we wanted to prove that maybe that's not necessarily the case.
That's amazing. Can we talk about the point you make in the paper that says most women with twin pregnancies in a hospital setting have few options but cesarean section, like you just mentioned, Dr. Stu, even though the evidence shows no benefit to surgery for the majority of cases. So that, of course, goes so counter to what we're told because of the hospital protocols or the state regulations. Can you talk a little bit more about the evidence behind that? Because I feel like that's one statement where, no, there's actually no evidence that surgery is safer. Can you talk more about that and what questions might come up for people around that statement?
I'm going to defer to Rixa initially because Rixa can quote some of the papers like Korb and Blickstein and those things. Why don't you tell a little bit about the studies where, whether it was cephalic first twins or even breech first twins, the data. Why don't you just talk about that, Rixa, would you?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a lot of really good big studies on twin hospital birth, and almost all of them conclude that cesarean section is not beneficial as a routine basis, and thus that vaginal birth should be routinely offered because cesarean section doesn't improve outcomes. So, one of the really good ones to look at was, well, there was first the twin birth study, which is the companion to the term breech trial. It was done by the same people with the same objective, randomize women into, vaginal versus cesarean section. Only this was twins instead of breech. It was head first twins. And so they enrolled 2,800 women in multi-centers around the world and found no benefit to planned cesarean section. And then there's also a big one called JUMODA, which is also the companion to PREMODA, the big breech study in France and Belgium. And again, no benefit to cesarean for cephalic first twins because they were just only studying that in these first two papers. And these are large data sets, multi-center studies, hundreds of units, 106 units in the twin birth study and something like 174 in JUMODA. And JUMODA actually had a lot of interesting sub-analyses, one of which was looking at breech first twins. And that also found no benefit to cesarean section. And there's a few other interesting ones. I think Blickstein and a few other ones looking at breech first twins specifically. There's one by Korb. That's the sub-analysis of JUMODA. And these are all in our paper. There's one by Blickstein. There's one by Goldman and one by, Blickstein, and then another one by Bourg-Tambour, and then another one by Gasquier. And all of them are finding that breech first twins also can be born vaginally, and cesarean section is not an indication for breech first twins is not an indication for routine cesarean. So the evidence is mostly saying it's a reasonable choice for most twin pregnancies, and the practice is the opposite. Cesarean's done for most twin pregnancies. So what's going on here? I think it's interesting because in the term breech trial, the conclusion was opposite. It was that cesarean section is better. Given whatever the limitations are, that's what they concluded. And it drastically changed the cesarean rate with breeches. The same randomized controlled trial for twins found the opposite conclusion, and it didn't lower the C-section rate at all. It made no difference. It's still going up. So what that tells you is that when the evidence shows that C-sections are useful, C-sections go way up. When the evidence shows that C-sections are not useful, the C-section rate goes way up. It doesn't matter. It's a little bit crazy making. What's the point of doing studies if you actually don't follow the evidence, especially when the evidence is not what you want it to say? So
I think Rick's is pointing out a very important narrative that goes on in the medical cartel, and that is that here's what we want to do. Let's find studies that support what we want to do. Science used to be, I have a theory. Let's look at the evidence and see if my theory is true or not. Now science is, this is what we want to have happen. We want to induce all women at 39 weeks. Let's find a paper that makes it seem like it's okay. So they come up with the ARRIVE trial. And I used to say that about the term breech trial too, but the term breech trial has got so many flaws that we won't even, let's not say anything about that. But the twin breech trial, the twin study out of Canada by the same authors, there was a hospital-based birthing. It was in many centers in different countries, similar to the term breech trial, but they only had a success rate of 56.2%. Whereas the JUMODA study out of France and Belgium had a success rate close to 80%. And we had a success rate at home of 88.4%, overall 91.3%. Yet if you look at the United States, typically right now, it's almost a 75% C-section rate for twins. And what's really also frightening, and you'll probably get to this, Jamie, is that of the 25% that deliver vaginally, 10% of those will end up with a C-section for twin B, because the people delivering don't know what to do when twin B happens to be a little bit like,
Interesting.
a little rascally, so to speak, and turns sideways, or the cord falls out or whatever. They don't know what to do, which is one of the things that I and Rixa in our organizations are teaching. And these are basic skills that should be taught in every residency program and every midwifery program. And unfortunately, in the medical world, it's falling down. The reason that I can do what I do is because I trained in an era where this was just considered normal. Breech was considered normal. Matter of fact, we used to fight at County Hospital. We were at LA County USC as part of my training. We had a affiliation with Cedars-Sinai, and so I spent 4 months there, and I was on every other night for 4 months. So that's like 60 days, and they're doing about 65 babies a day there. They were doing 22,000 births a year. It was the busiest hospital in the United States in the early 1980s. And if you're doing 65 babies a day and 3 to 4% of babies are breached, then you're seeing 2 or 3 breaches every single day. And we would fight over who got to do the breaches, because we wanted to do it. Because first of all, they were all done in lithotomy position, and they were all done hands-on. And you got to feel like a doctor because you were doing something. And we weren't scared of them. We weren't trained to be scared of them. And then something triggered. Something happened. Rixa, I don't think you know either. Something just happened in the psyche, and they just decided they didn't want to do it anymore.
Once you start the trend towards cesarean, it's really hard to stop that ball rolling down the hill. I mean, it is really a slippery slope. If you start on it, it gains momentum. It's really hard to stop it, because once you start de-skilling, then the fear goes up, the skills go down, and as the skills go down, the fear goes up even more. And so, I think that once the trend caught on, it was really, really difficult to stop.
And also, this isn't cynical. This is factual. But the hospital's intention is not the same as maybe the practitioner's intention. The hospital intention is to keep its doors open. And financially, hospitals do better when you have a cesarean section. Hospitals do better when babies go to the newborn intensive care unit. Do you know that admissions to the newborn intensive care unit over the last 15 years have nearly doubled, from a little over 5% to a little over 9%? Now, that doesn't bode well for the medical community, because either one of two things is happening. Either all their interventions and all their ultrasounds and all their monitoring and all their inductions are leading to more NICU admissions, which is not good testimony for their model of care, or because NICUs generate a lot of revenue, they're finding new reasons to put babies in the NICU, which also doesn't give good testimony to their model of care. So the fact that the NICU rates admissions are going up, and yet the people running the system want to continue to do more of it, more of what they're doing, more cesarean sections, more inductions, de-skilling of practitioners, increasing revenues. This is why I did what I did. It was a big reason why I left the system. I couldn't play that game anymore. I couldn't skew my counseling to fit with the hospital's model of care. It's an ethical violation that goes on in every single doctor's office, in every single hospital, every day. We all have a bias, and it's fair to have bias, but it's not fair to be unethical, and that's what's going on.
Yeah, because how could you have counseled women once you had the breech, VBAC, and twin bands? I mean, you could be honest and be like, look, the hospital won't let me do it. They are making me force you to have a C-section. If not, I'm being threatened to lose my job. But that's a horrible thing to have to tell somebody. Because that's a non-medical issue. You shouldn't, you should be counseling on the risks and benefits of different interventions and alternatives if they don't like them, not hospital politics. It's so messed up when that would have to be the conversation if you're trying to still offer births in a setting that's banning them.
Yeah, I mean, my colleagues who are doctors are between a rock and a hard place. And it's part of their own making, but they really have this. It's kind of a Sophie's choice. It's basically keep your ethics and lose your job, or keep your job and lose your ethics. And most of them choose the latter because they put so many years into it. They can't afford to be fired. They have mortgages and children and college and all the things that they have, the expenses. So they just keep their head down. They just go about working their shift and doing their job, and the model doesn't allow them the time to give women full informed consent. So they just skew their consent to get the woman to comply. I mean, there are systems that don't let women go past 41 weeks. But we know it's perfectly fine to go past 41 weeks. So these doctors have to tell women at 40 weeks and a few days that, boy, if you're not in labor by Thursday, then we have to induce your labor. Knowing full well that that's not the only choice, but that's the only choice they're given. And so that is emphasized, especially with things like twins. They're not comfortable with twins going past certain number of weeks, depending on the type of twinning. And they all follow this very standardized protocol. It's an algorithm. If you're mono-di, this is what happens. If you're di-di, this is what happens. If you're mono-mono, oh my God, this is really awful for you. And by the way, the evidence doesn't support anything that they're doing. But they do it anyway. As Rixa said, everything leads to more interventions because more interventions leads to more revenue.
And by the way, what was the average gestation for your twin paper? I think it was
39.0 weeks with a range of 35 to 42 weeks. We had many twins that went into labor at 35 weeks and 5 days or 36 weeks and 6 days or whatever. So that means we had to have some that went to 41 to 42 weeks. And, we were keeping an eye on them and they were well informed. And by the end, they were probably going nuts. How far did you go?
38 and 2.
Oh, so you were lucky. Because if you're at 41 weeks with twins or 41 and a half weeks, you're pulling your hair out. You're just ready to have those babies. But they trusted the system. They trusted their team and they trusted their bodies. And so we had a wide variation, but the average was 39.0 weeks, which is farther than the standard medicalized model that wants any twins to go.
Right. And since you brought up NICU admissions, I don't know is a 9% just overall NICU admission? It's not specific to twins, right?
No, that's just overall, right?
Overall. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see, even though this is a very important paper, it's a small sample size as it, is natural with twins. I'm curious on what the average NICU admission is for twins in the hospital setting versus what you guys saw. And it's probably in there in your paper, but I don't have it right in front of me for what your NICU admission was.
Rixa, you want to talk about intention to treat?
Yeah. So I'm just looking here on our paper. I think there was one neonatal transfer, right?
Just the one twin A that was breathing fast and not having good oxygen saturation after about an hour, and we just decided to send the baby in. And it turned out the baby just had what's called transient tachypnea of the newborn. So we had how many babies did we have at home, Rixa? 61. So 122 babies at home. Yep. And we had one NICU transfer. But we don't. The issue is we don't know what happened to the ones. There were 31 sets of twins who were transferred antepartum. And Rixa makes it very clear in the paper that we didn't do what's called intention to treat. We didn't follow up on what happened to those 31 sets of twins.
Yeah, we could only do intention to treat for the ones that actually went into labor under Stu's care, because the rest that transferred prior to labor, we can't even follow up what happened. They were no longer essentially planning a home birth anymore.
Right.
Because something came up. So we just did intention to treat once labor started, which I think is a little more reasonable thing to look at anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So
the other interesting thing, Jamie, let me just elaborate on that a little bit. The Maternal Fetal Medicine Society has redefined the term growth restriction to be less than the 10th percentile. Okay. And I want
Let's
to make
talk
this
about that actually. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I actually got a question on Instagram about this in preparation for this episode. They asked, can you talk about true fetal growth restriction in twins and if that applies at all to the paper? So go ahead.
Oh, you want to read the question or you want me to just go ahead?
It's just a very one-liner. It's
okay. Well,
can you talk about fetal growth restriction in twins and if that came up in the paper at all?
Well, that is not the definition that we use in the paper, because that definition is a ridiculous definition. Because if you're saying it's less than the 10th percentile, then you're basically saying that 10% of babies in the United States are growth restricted. And that's crazy. I mean, we have people that are 5'2" and we have people that are 7 foot tall. And we have all kinds of different things. So you can't just categorize them into, just concrete like that. The concrete thinking it doesn't work that way. But what's really important to understand about twins is the problem of how growth restriction is diagnosed with them. All ultrasound machines have a graph inside of them put out by a guy named Hadlock, and it's a growth chart. And they're automatically plotted. The machines do this. They plot them and they print them out, and they're very nice looking printouts that come out, and they put a little dot where your baby is. And those are designed for singletons. And from my experience, and I have Rixa chime in, we find that twins grow about the same rate as singletons till about 26 or 27 weeks or so. And then the twins begin to fall off the growth curve of singletons. And yet they're plotted on a scale that's designed for singletons. So they all look like they're falling off their growth curve when they're actually not falling off their growth curve. They're growing perfectly fine for twins. And using that kind of criteria, we had, I think you said we had 122 babies at home. We had one baby that we called or we would have considered to be growth restricted. I think that's right. Rixa, you might correct me if I'm wrong.
Look it up. Yeah. I'm looking, I was corresponding with MFM or OB David Coggan-Karp in Vermont. He supports breech up there. And he's UK trained, I believe. And he uses the ISCOG guidelines for SGA and FGR rather than the ACOG because they're much better. They are defined as fetal growth restriction is only defined as under the 3rd percentile and or abnormal Dopplers, not 10th, but 3rd. So it's actually really looking at the ones that are getting on the outliers. So that itself, if you redefined it as under the 3rd, including abnormal Dopplers, would make a big difference rather than looking at just under the 10th centile.
And if you use a twin growth curve as well.
Yeah, for sure.
But getting back to my point before, my cynical point is that if you redefine IUGR as greater than the 10th percentile, you create a lot more work for maternal fetal medicine doctors. And you create a lot more reasons for interventions, all of which generate revenue and don't improve outcomes. This is ultimately what Rixa and I determined, is that it's not about whatever your intent is, it's about outcomes. And if your model of care is such that your outcomes are getting better, then God bless you. But if your model of care is such that outcomes are getting worse, or you're doing more interventions and it's not changing the outcomes, then maybe you need to reevaluate what you're doing. And maybe what you're doing with twins is completely inappropriate. Not maybe. It is.
Yeah. And outcomes don't just mean neonatal short-term outcomes. That's the problem. It's like the whole reason we induce at 37, 38 weeks for twins, depending on the kind of twin, is because there's a tiny rise in stillbirth as they go over. But what are all the other, for saving, a tiny number of babies per 10,000, then you're doing a massive number of inductions and cesareans and, crazy complicated births that would have been pretty uncomplicated had you waited till she went into labor, with the tiny increase in the risk of stillbirth. So, it's not just short-term neonatal outcomes. People tend to ignore long-term childhood outcomes and all the maternal outcomes associated with it, and we have this crazy cesarean rate. 75% cesarean rate is not a good outcome.